Hello, everyone, and welcome to this somewhat impromptu stream. We've been talking about this for a little while, Nathan and I. Nathan, CJ Hood, welcome.
Hello, good to be here. I'm excited to be here for the stream. As you say, it's been a while. It feels like the cycles come round and we're right in the right place now for this stream.
Exactly. I think this started, for anyone who don't know or haven't seen the title of this video, we're here today to talk about the philosophy of Dark Souls and the universe, I suppose, of Dark Souls, and how that pertains to real world religion, myths, and a bit about what inspirations Dark Souls takes from our stories in quote unquote real life. We started talking about, I think you made a tweet or something almost a month ago, maybe more, about doing a Dark Souls video, and I messaged you because I've always joked about doing a Dark Souls video at some point. I think I messaged you saying that I've been thinking about doing this for a long time. Please let me help.
And I was more than glad to have that help because I had just finished Dark Souls 3, and so I was filled with enthusiasm. But I only really had I wouldn't say a shallow understanding of the universe at that point, but I had some understanding. But then you've played the games a lot more than me, and as we'll probably see tonight, there's just so many avenues that you can go off on with these games because
Oh yes,
they integrate so many ideas and values and motifs that that are very rich and come from various gold mines of tradition that you can just see a new angle each time, and a new way to see the game, or a new perspective within the game. And it kind of blends these together in such a fantastic way that it never feels like it's imposing one upon you, but you can just explore it as you go. So it's been great just kind of opening my eyes to that, as well, in preparation for this.
yes, and I suppose I should say, as a bit of a disclaimer, it's been a while since I've it's probably been like a year or more since I've touched anything related to Dark Souls, and as it pertains to playing the games. We talked about Elden Ring. That's probably the closest thing when that came out a year ago or something. And so it's probably 2 years since I last played any Dark Souls game. Although I am a huge nerd, so I know a lot about the lore. But if I get some of like the names wrong, I'll try to do my best to explain because I keep forgetting and mixing up the names because it's like Gwyn, Gwendolyn, Guinevere. Uh, yes. But I think we should just start talking just a little bit about the game and how we've sort of interacted with them. Uh, you said you had recently played Dark Souls 1, sorry, 3.
Yeah, that's right. So my actual first experience of Dark Souls 3 was many, many years ago. I picked it up. I'd heard a lot about it. I thought, okay, this sounds interesting. A hard game that you're supposed to, it shows that you're a good video game player or whatever. Fantasy themes. It sounds
Right.
like something that would appeal to me. I tried
Hmm.
it, and I just didn't get it at the time. I was hating the experience. I
Mm,
think I got to Farron Wood in a swamp somewhere. I was totally lost. I had no clue what was going on. I was getting smashed by some giant with a big
right.
tree in his hand, and I was just like, I've had enough of this. I give up. So
I
then,
mean, Dark Souls 3 is a bit of a
yeah,
challenge starting at. I found it better, for people who have played along from Dark Souls 1 or either just started at Dark Souls 1. It's a lot more forgiving in
mm,
teaching you sort of the ground level back and forth, which then gets sort of like tightened more and more until you get to Dark Souls 3, where there's like you're still almost doing this turn-based combat thing, right? But
yeah.
it's the margins for error are so razor thin at that point, right?
Oh, most definitely. I discovered that very quickly, because you have is it Udix Gundir?
Gundyr.
Yeah, that's right. And like he's just a you've only just killed like a few minions, and then you're
He's
straight
like the
into a
"you have
boss
to be
fight.
this tall to ride" boss. Yeah.
It's like, okay, well, welcome to Dark Souls 3.
Mhm.
Um, so I had a bad experience, put the game away, didn't play it for maybe 5 years or something like that. And then more recently, I kind of thought, okay, I'm going to give it another go. Um, I, but this time I'm going to embrace the fact that I'm going to die a lot. I'm going to have to grind a lot, and I'm going to just have to explore and not be too worried about getting it right first time
Mhm.
or whatnot. And I just loved it after that. And I enjoyed just finding out more and more about this world, exploring the different enemies, seeing them as a challenge that should be overcome, not necessarily immediately, but through trial and error and learning their patterns, getting stronger yourself, and so on. And yeah, so I was thoroughly. It made me think, oh, I've missed out so much here. But maybe the intervening years of DR content have helped me get to this point.
It's hardened you, is that it? Yeah.
Yes, yes. What about yourself?
Oh, well, I have to think back. I remember playing Dark Souls 1 a long, long time ago. I can't remember quite when it came out. Is it 2011 or something? So I played it not when it was sort of like new in the West, but I played it shortly before Dark Souls 2 came out. And I played it sort of because Dark Souls 2 was coming out and there was a big sort of hype thing. And all of my friends were like, oh, Dark Souls 2 is coming out. It's going to be huge. So I figured, I have to play it, I guess. And it was a very eye-opening experience for me, and I remember seeing recently that, in some random headline that Dark Souls in some poll or in some award stuff got voted, the greatest game of all time. Um, and it was certainly like top of the decade of the 2010s. I'm not sure if that's, I'd give it that praise, but even to this day, the approach that the creator and the team that created these games have taken to sort of merge the cons to me personally, I mean, it's a very good merge and blend of the concepts of the mechanical sides of role-playing games and the physical, quote unquote, sides of action gaming, trying to recreate an actual world. Because if you play something like Morrowind, or any sort of top-down role-playing games, or even ARPGs, etc., etc., your brain has to do some, creative translation. I mean, you swing your sword, and if you miss, nothing happens. I mean, maybe if Morrowind had like some feedback showing that whatever you're trying to hit is dodging, maybe that would feel better. But the game doesn't, so you sort of have to interpret that yourself. That's just a concession of the technology, really, because the simulation underneath is very complex to give you that sense of realism. But of course, it requires you to engage with it. But what Dark Souls does, and I can understand how they did it at the time without, working incredibly hard, is mapping that role playing system that it does have in terms of where you put your stats mechanically with the actual animations and your character's place in the world to the point where it most of the time matches one to one. If I have, the big berserk sword, right? I'm not sure what is it called something special? I don't remember. The big
Oh,
Japanese berserk sword, yeah.
the Black Sword, yes.
The black sword, okay. If I have that sword in Dark Souls, I also have the stats that matches how I look and how I play, right? I have the strength, I have the armor that makes me do the fat rolling if I do have that armor, right? Everything maps from how I build my character to how I play my character and how I interact with the world. My weaknesses towards one boss or my strengths towards another match perfectly to the build that I chose. And if I choose to engage with the mechanics in that way, I will be rewarded by the game because the game will say, yes and to me. It won't say, no, that's a build that doesn't work, right? And I've always
Hmm.
seen um, message boards like 4chan has a history of inventing terms that then sort of grow outside of their boundaries and change meaning. I always have had a sneaking suspicion that the sort of get good mentality came from video game message boards on 4chan that were designed in the same way that things like tits or GTFO were, where someone would go on the board and they would
Hmm.
uh, um, and complain about the game being hard, right, without really having engaged with the game. And this was like a shorthand of saying, well, we're not going to help you try to figure out yourself because the game really does explain itself to you if you just bother reading it. But you can't think of it like any other game you've previously played, especially back then, right?
No, definitely not. And indeed, I was probably that person complaining on the message boards initially. That was my experience of it. But I think it is what you've just said. You have to really throw yourself into it to get the reward from it. Whereas many games you could just coast along without necessarily putting in the imagination and effort. And still, so you mentioned Morrowind, but I would say Skyrim is a good example of this. You can hit your
Skyrim is the
sword.
anti-Morrowind in that sense, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And
Like you can just go around, you can, hit the bandits, build up your attributes without you as a player becoming more skillful and
or
succeed in the game.
understanding the systems anymore. In fact, a
Yeah.
game like Skyrim refuses to tell you a lot of what's going on under the hood, right? You put points and
Hmm.
perks, you have no idea what they do. Something goes up by 5%. Okay, what does that actually mean, right?
Right.
There's no
Hmm.
feedback from the game other than, am I going to have to hit this skeleton a million times or 100 times before it dies? Because that's what Oblivion and Skyrim basically all turn into eventually.
Most definitely. I guess the other thing to compare here, which I think goes to your point about there being real feedback, is in something like Skyrim, the enemies scale to your level. Whereas in Dark Souls, they don't
Right.
scale, they stay the
Oh,
same. So you
yeah.
can track your progress, you can track how good you are against whether you can, whether you're able to beat this enemy now, and how easy it becomes as you go on later in the game. So when you
Yes.
start, these minions, these kind of grug enemies are difficult, but it should be 30 hours later, you're able just to like one hit them and you can feel the power difference.
Not
Uh,
just that, you go
yeah.
back and their animation seems like they're, molasses. They're in slow motion because you're
Yeah.
now used to a harder difficulty, right? You're used to sort of
Mm.
the language of combat that is used in Dark Souls.
And there was a good example of this kind of shift in a video I saw recently. It was somebody had taken the soul of Cinder, so the final boss of Dark Souls 3, and put it up against every boss from the game. And
Hmm.
the first one, it was there's the second one it showed was Vort of the Boreal Valley. So this is a character you meet kind of early in the game, towards the end of your initial time in Lothric. And when you first meet him, he's a unit. Like he feels very quick and strong,
Yeah.
and he's going to destroy you very quickly. And so you're going to have to grind to get more, better stats and so on, so you can beat him. But the Soul of Cinder just like hits it 2 times and it dies. And but yourself, if you've beaten the Soul of Cinder, that you can take its hits more than Ward of the Boreal Valley. So even by the measure of the bosses, you have become so much more powerful. And I thought that really showed it.
Yeah, unless you do one of those naked runs, but then you've
That's
reached a
another level.
level of player skill which then outshines the mechanics, and I think that's another layer that the game still allows for skill to overcome any challenge. So my point is that it melds this mechanics and player skill and feedback in terms of your animations and the enemy's animations into a very and I don't want to use the word realism because it's not realistic. I think there's a word for it. I guess verisimilitude is the word. It feels very believable when you swing your sword. it reacts the way you would expect based on the way you've built your character, right? There's
And
a one-to-one ratio there.
there is, and the flip side of that is even if you have great armor, great weapons, great stats, if you make a mistake, you still get punished for it. So
Yes,
even if it
obviously.
is a grog, even if it is a grog from the very first level, they could still kill you if you don't take it seriously
Certainly,
enough.
yeah.
So there's always that. You have to play well. You have to have the skill to succeed in the game, even if you've
The
advanced
will.
everything else. The will to win. Yes,
Exactly. Okay, so should we start talking a bit about the concepts of the world of Dark Souls, then maybe as an entrance into the philosophy? I think the best way to set the scene here is to talk a bit about the meme, I suppose, of its creation. Goes that the director something Miyazaki is his last name, I think, was very into English books or something like that when he was young, or he was very into Western fantasy, but he didn't read a lot of English. So he'd go to the library and he'd, read a lot of these old, either Arthurian legends or Germanic stories, and get sort of like an image in his head of old European legends, while also only understanding about like 40% of the words. And that feeling of discovering a world like that is what he wanted to recreate in the original Dark Souls. To a certain extent, of course, there's other things he wanted to put in, but that's part of it. And that's why a lot of the imagery, especially in the first Dark Souls, is very, very European. And specifically at times Germanic. And that is also reflected, of course, in the philosophy and um, the actions and the consequences of the characters in the story.
I think that's right, and it's but what it allows for then is because he didn't have a full appreciation or full understanding of the details or necessarily all the values. You get this kind of integration of ideas which maybe are somewhat conflicting, but they can
Hmm.
sit under these symbols or these aesthetics. And it means he's also able to integrate Japanese or Asian influences as well with these Norse and Germanic ideals too, and in quite a compelling way. So it feels to me it feels different playing it, although I see the European influences there. You've got your dragons, for example. You're in medieval armor. You're on top of a castle or whatever. The world
Yeah,
has a different. Mo- I hesitate to use the word moral because one of the things is it doesn't necessarily have a moral kind of sphere, but maybe a different kind of metaphysics or way of working than typical Western fantasy has.
certainly, yeah. It allows it to sort of, because there's not a lot of room in Western media these days for any sort of cyclical
Mm.
view of history, right? But through, I think you put me onto this, and I tried to do some research on it. It seems that, by filtering this through some Buddhist philosophy, you're basically ending up at the same sort of general structure of these civilizational cycles, and using basically the world of Dark Souls as a metaphor for something like that, which I find very interesting. And then, of course, because some of the imagery is a bit haphazard, or haphazardly borrowed from European lore, some of it is, very poignant, and something is just there because it's cool. You have to sort of parse that as you're digging into it.
Yeah, I
But
think
but
that's a
but
fair
I
point.
think
There's a lot of
one of the starker sort of contrasts like that is, let me double check the name here. I think I said one of them in Dark Souls 1, and I'm sorry, Nathan, I'm going to spoil you here, is the 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 final son of Gwyn, which is Gwendolyn, I
Yes.
recall. Um, you're this medieval knight in like shining armor, more or less, at this point, at the top of a very European style cathedral, fighting, the last son of the old king, who's basically gone mad due to his father's disdain for him, which is basically a Japanese story, it seems, in this sort of very European setting, right? This, I can't live up to the expectations of my father, which I seem to think is much more Japanese than it is Western. I don't know if you've encountered that sort of story before.
I mean, I think in older literature there would have been this sense of, oh, the king needs to produce an heir who's worthy.
Ah, fair
Um,
enough. Yeah.
but I think in modern times, Japanese culture, although it's shifted away from the traditional family, there's still that resonance of, a father is trying to have find some heir that will continue his business,
Mm.
and it's not just so it could be a son, but if there is not one who is worthy or there isn't a son available, he might even adopt another man just so he can carry on the family business,
Well,
which
the
is
only thing
totally
I've
alien to
interacted
us, right?
right, the only thing I've heard sort of that interacts with this is that you hear stories of Japanese companies who basically would
Mm.
rather, run bankrupt than betray their sort of traditional values or traditional ways of operation, because they've been left behind, quote unquote, in the market, right?
That sounds
So it's
familiar.
some of these like strange, I guess, idiosyncratic moments that makes it something special.
Mm.
I'm not saying this isn't in Western literature. I'm just saying that the specific way that it's being represented has got the coat of paint uh, of the Western literature or the Western lore, but it doesn't quite, there's something off about it, but in a very interesting way. But that was just something I, pulled out of my ass. There's probably a lot, a lot of
Well,
other examples.
I think there's just one thing that I would add to this, which is there is kind of precedent for this in a strange way, because if you look at something like Wagner's Ring Cycle, um, that is heavily drawing upon Germanic mythology. It's supposed to be a restoration of it and showing that to an audience. But many of the values that underpin it, Wagner himself hadn't read Schopenhauer when he first wrote it, but as it went through revisions and so on, he read Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer was heavily influenced by Buddhism. Wagner would state, "Oh, this only expresses it. It's not actually the source of where these values come from, but it expresses how I see the ring cycle. It expresses what I was trying to get across in the ring cycle."
Mm.
So you already have this idea in the 19th century that Northern European mythology and various East Asian religious ideas have a synergy and have fundamentally the same message. So I think it's interesting then, almost a century or so later, somebody coming from the Japanese context almost hits upon that somewhat accidentally, and it brings this very powerful and then compelling world for players to engage with.
So moving on from that, I think we should talk about the idea of, the fire and souls and sort of these broad metaphysical concepts that exist in the world of Dark Souls. So for those of you who haven't played the games, here's a very brief, I guess, overview of how the metaphysics, I guess, works. Um, uh, Dark Souls is a world where, before, I suppose, recorded time, there exists only sort of the eternity of nature. There's only these massive trees, as far as the eye can see, who stretch miles high in the sky, and among them fly the dragons, who are eternal, which is something that I find very interesting because it echoes Nordic sagas as well. And one day, basically, entities discover what's called the flame or the fire. These are small entities of what would become humanity, which is not necessarily means just humans, but the concept of of a human, I guess. And they then turn into gods by feeding on this flame. And the biggest and most powerful of them is sort of the Odin Zeus type analogy, who is the Lord of Fire, Gwyn, who uses the power of the fire to basically build a glorious kingdom. And he takes the fight to the dragons and kills almost all of the dragons and brings about sort of the age of man, or the age of fire, as it's called, where light enters the world and everything is great, except it isn't necessarily. But we enter the story at the point where Gwyn and most of his ilk are either dead or dying. And this world has been going for a long time. And what Gwyn has done is that he has basically locked himself away and is sacrificing himself to keep this sort of core of the civilization going. Literally, in the Dark Souls world, the fire is sort of the engine of all light and sustenance, it seems. And the problem is that a lot of people then on the fringes seem to be unable to die, and they become hollow, as it's called, where they become undead and they basically just go feral. Eventually, they don't die, but they just sort of wander around like zombies. This is called the curse of undeath. I'm glossing over like a million things here. I'm sure people in the comments are going to be like, "You forgot to mention that," but I'm trying to be be quick about it for anyone who don't know it. So you start as this nameless nobody undead, on the brink of hollowing, basically, in a cell at the edge of the empire, more or less, and you spend the entire game sort of working your way through the various areas of this kingdom, or empire, or whatever you want to call it, um, until you reach the core, which is Gwyn himself. And trying to think if there's anything I glossed over. There's a lot I glossed over. Is there anything that's more important? Along the way, every time you defeat something, every time you defeat a boss, you're gained what's called a soul, or more soul, which is currency you use to basically put points in your attributes. So if you want more strength because you want to wield the big sword, you have to kill things, take their souls, and use that to power yourself.
I think you did an admirable job of getting the core concepts. You should write a blurb for Dark Souls, I think. It's quite impressive. I guess I think maybe the only thing to add is, so you're making your way towards Gwyn, and the kind of the thing that confronts you is that if when you defeat Gwyn, you have the choice either to keep the civilization going by linking the fire, by giving yourself to the fire, to maintain it, or to reject that and usher in what's called the Age of Dark. So the extinguishing of the flame, the destruction of these civilizations, and so on. So I think that kind of gives the shape of the narrative, as it were, at a very simple level.
That's a very, very basic, but if you just like one thread in a game that's got a million, that's one of them, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because some of the more interesting topics revolve around Gwyn and his sort of similar figures in the other games as well, because Gwyn is only a character really in Dark Souls 1, although you mentioned Soul of Cinder. Soul of Cinder explicitly, of course, fights very similarly to Gwyn, only, of course, a lot more amped up. Most
Yes.
likely because it's the manifestation of, everyone who has linked the fire throughout the ages. But there are obviously, I mentioned to you, Vendrick from Dark Souls 2 is a take on someone in a Gwyn-like position who
Mhm.
refused who actually refused to make any choice and was punished for that. But what is sort of clear, I guess, is that Gwyn has chosen to sort of in his arrogance, Gwyn has chosen to link the fire or to create uh, sort of the I guess the bedrock for the fire to be linked in order to preserve a civilization that was already dying, and that causes, according to Dark Souls 1 at least, and specifically, or definitely Dark Souls 3, causes a lot more pain, arguably, than allowing the fire to die. That's one way to look at the games, right?
Very
That's a
much
very
so.
pro Age of Dark ending, obviously, right?
Yeah, so you mentioned that linking the fire is the cause of um, the undead. So characters unable to die, unable to get rest, and instead going, as you said, feral, mad, insane. And actually, many of the enemies that you fight are these hollows who have been robbed of their dignity, essentially, and they're these mindless
Yes,
beasts.
I've said that they turn beast-like and they don't really become anything more than the dragons would be. I mean, they become just, mindless beasts essentially, which is what the dragons are in this world. I mean, they are, majestic, beautiful creatures, but at the end of the day, they're not men as we would call them.
No, no, and I guess in addition to that is you see the decay in the world, which is not done away with by the linking of the fire. It just seems to keep on going, this decay. So the corruption remains. It's like
Mhm.
being. I remember somebody comparing it to like having a cancerous growth, but never having relief from it. So you're in constant
Right.
pain. The world is in constant pain and suffering, but it can never either be healed of it or escape it through death.
And
Um,
more importantly,
mm,
it's also prevented from ever reaching the height of what it once was when Gwyn was, truly the Lord of Fire, right?
mm,
Because it's
mm.
continually existing in this state of slow decline, and then there's like a minor like blip on the the radar, right? And then it goes up a little bit, and then it starts going down again, and this becomes explicit in Dark Souls 3, as I'm no doubt you're aware of, is this decay. I mean, at the end of the time, basically. Uh, all right, I should probably add that in Dark Souls 3, to just summarize that real quickly in like one sentence, in Dark Souls 3, you play a person who's been a hollow, who's been awakened for the explicit purpose of taking on a bunch of kings like Gwyn, who have throughout the years refused to link the fire because it's been going on for so long that everyone is tired, and the world is literally in like this backwater sort of whirlpool-esque drain becoming mushed together. So the decay, as you put it, has become so
Mm.
it's just stagnancy, really. That's what it is. um and that's something that really comes to bear towards the end of Dark Souls 3.
Very much so. As you said, literal kind of countries are collapsing in together. You wander through ruins constantly, and the one that really springs to my mind is uh, the Abyss Watchers and Farron Keep, because the Abyss Watchers, they're one of the bosses in Dark Souls 3 that you must defeat. That they had linked the fire. They had done that because they were mighty heroes who wanted to see the world restored. They are then raised from the dead to redo this process because it's needed to be done again. And they see what's happened to the land that they try to protect, and it's become this festering swamp filled with monsters. And they refuse to do it because they see it didn't actually deal with what they had hoped.
Hmm.
It's just at best it's like a little temporary upwards push, a little bit of restoration, but then falling ever more into entropic chaos. And even those sorts of heroic figures were unwilling to link the fire. Um, yeah, so Dark Souls 3 really ramps up that sense of decay.
So let's take a step back and talk about sort of the journey that you go on throughout the games and in Dark Souls 1. Um, because you asked me at some point whether or not, there is actual agency, or if there's how the sort of the games and the world use the idea of strength.
Mm.
And I think another thing the games do, which works on both a video game level and also a metaphysical level within the universe, is the thing we talked about earlier with you becoming more powerful. And you can go back and see that, because you start as literally nothing and you end by defeating the former king, and by the virtue of sort of having basically killed anyone who stand in your way and taking their power, you get to decide the fate of the world. And that is a very interesting thing that video games often, of course, do indirectly. A lot of Western media does, especially, post-war Western media, as part of, I guess, the hero's journey. Because when the hero returns from the magical land and all that with his gifts, he's then showering his new knowledge and power upon the people. But it's taken very directly here, and you're presented with this choice of, okay, well, what's to be done? Do I link the fire or don't I? And I don't really have all of the information at the point where I'm like, if you play the games, you pay attention to the dialogue, you try to read some of the tooltips. I mean, you have to be very dutiful if you're if you're gonna play the game the first time, get to the place, the bonfire at the end, and be like, I think I have enough information to make an informed decision here. You have to go sort of with your gut feeling, which is earned again by virtue of you being the strongest one in the universe at that point.
That's a great point, and it ties in with the story, doesn't it? Because how does Gwyn get the choice to even link the fire? He himself had to conquer the dragons. He
Mm.
and his forces became the strongest in the universe, and thus were able to direct it. And in Dark Souls 2, in the DLC, the the Scholar of the First Sin, there's this dialogue. I think Aldia and Vendrix both talk about the true king who sits on the throne and who gets to decide whether we renew the age of fire or go
Mm.
into the age of dark. And as you say, the story and the gameplay then fit together so perfectly in quite a unique way, because the world is fundamentally changed by your decision at the end, after you've gone through this process of going from weakness to strength, from a victim to a conqueror. You feel that it has had a decisive impact, that everything centers around your choice. And I think this aspect of not having a clear sense of which way to go, like not being spoon fed the answer, is quite important to that, because then you're not relying on somebody else's view or somebody else's vision. It's very much, I'm making this decision, I have to do that, even if I regret it later. So it becomes centered on your will, which has been the thing that overcame
and
everything
and
else.
and not just, you as in your character, but you as the player, right?
Yes.
You
Hmm.
are along for that journey, essentially. um which is very, unique in a lot of games, because they're, again, a bit that like 1-to-1 ratio of your character, or the mechanics and the visuals. I think there's a bit of a stronger than usual connection between you as the player and the narrative um of what that, little guy on the screen is doing.
I totally agree with that, and I think so. Again, to make a comparison with Skyrim, and I promise I'm not just going to dunk on Skyrim in this stream. I did I do enjoy Skyrim, but I think you can see the difference in, and this might be because it's an open world game, it suffers from this, but you defeat, you know, your quest is to, the main quest, you are a hero who's kind of come from nothing, who's discovered to be this powerful prophesied figure who must overcome Alduin, this dragon which wants to destroy the world. And when you do so, what happens? Very little. The world is not changed in any fundamental way. Yes, you might have a couple of rewards and you might have a couple of options, but it doesn't feel like it's had any material impact on you as the player or on the world about you. The environment hasn't changed in any significant way.
And the weird thing is, you know, you can play through that in Skyrim and go back and continue playing the game for, you know, 1,000 more hours.
Yes.
But Dark Souls ends when you make that decision, and still it feels more rewarding, right?
Definitely, because it feels like the world has changed as a consequence of your decision. Perhaps
Right.
because it finishes. So
Maybe.
you don't, you know, it'd be
You
quite
don't-
difficult. It'd be quite difficult to actually like
Right.
develop the Age of Darkness.
Of course,
or whatever,
but
right?
I mean that's Bethesda's problem, not mine.
Oh, no, definitely, definitely. But so
It's easy
I
to be a
think
critic.
very, very easy. But I think it then for Dark Souls, this this strong synergy of your actions or your inputs into the game fundamentally altering it, whether you live or die, the choices about how the world will move forward. It feels like you every time it has significance, and that's reflected in what we were talking about earlier, both in your journey and in every single encounter.
Very good. Let's see here. I'm just gonna have to look at my notes because I don't want to miss anything, but there's so many many things we can talk about. We
Is
went
it
on
worth
like a we
is it
went on
worth
a Elric tangent. We went on a Berserk tangent for a bit.
is it worth talking about why Gwyn, you know, why Gwyn linked it at all, and maybe the positive
Yes,
spin on
sure.
this?
Yeah,
Because one of
it's easy to damn him for just, you know, linking it and then leaving it at that.
and it certainly seems like when you first play the games that it's presented as a good thing and that you should want to repeat what Gwyn's done. At least in Dark Souls 3, that's when you first get to Firelink Shrine, which is very early in the game. The Firelink Maiden and other characters are wanting you to carry on what's happened here. So your initial instinct is, oh, maybe this was a good thing.
You
And
have to do a bit of, you know, sleuthing and legwork if you actually want to, in Dark Souls 1, if you actually want to find the Age of Dark. And I'll be honest, I wouldn't have known about it if it wasn't for, you know, the internet telling me that it was an option, right? Although I did figure it out on my own once I knew that it was an option, right?
yeah,
But if you, especially if you were used to how games were back when Dark Souls came out, you just followed the, you know, the Age of Fire, and then your guy burns up in front of a bonfire, and you're like, that's it, right? That's the game, right?
and but you at least think, oh, that's what I was meant to do. That
Right.
was the
Yeah.
proper ending. And I well, there's a couple of things here. One is just um the idea of fire, or the resonance of fire. We look at like classical mythology and history. Uh, Kalanges in his work The Ancient City goes through a number of sources such as Plato and others, detailing how in every kind of Roman and Greek house, the man of the house would tend the hearth, tend the fire, and this was replicated on a citywide level. That the ruler was ultimately a priest who tends the fire, and this is the connection with the divine world. And in a sense, if the fire ever went out, then the life of the city would die because they've lost that connection with the divine. And I definitely think you can see that idea in Dark Souls with Gwyn. You know, he wants to maintain the fire, to maintain his civilization. You as the player Where is your safe place in this world that's absolutely hostile and wants to rip you apart? It's at the bonfires. You kindle
Mm.
bonfires as you go through the game, essentially establishing like areas where you've conquered by
Zones of
lighting another
control, yeah.
zones of control, zones of safety, places which are, in Saxon literature, the hearth is a warm, safe place where mead is passed round and so on. I think you kind of get that sense in the game. So on a gameplay level, you intuitively pick up, oh, the fire is a good place, the rest of the world is bad. And Gwyn is essentially carrying that out on a civilizational scale. He wants his civilization to continue, and future linkers of the fire want the world to continue with how it is, and they believe by kindling the fire you will restore what has been decaying.
Right. And I think, for me, coming off of the Witten this year with entropy, having, the scowl of Spengler grace many of the PowerPoints, including my own, it's an interesting sort of topic to discuss while thinking about sort of the situation we find ourselves in, because a lot of people obviously, and to a certain extent me as well, believe that we are um, at the cusp of, if not sort of entering a civilizational winter, as he calls it. And the question then becomes, how should one sort of ride through that storm? Should you work for it to end? Should you try to force an ending? Should you link the fire? Should you fight tooth and nail, etc., etc.? And I talked a lot about that at the Witten, with how the Nordic view and how some of the Anglo view. You had an essay that I quoted, talking about Tolkien and how he borrowed heavily from both of these sources when it comes to sort of the willingness to fight despite sort of overwhelming odds of destruction. And so I think it's easy to say that Gwyn is the bad guy because he linked the fire or because he refused to die, but I mean, what is really the other alternative? you know, the ultimate failure is of someone like Vendrick in Dark Souls 2, who refused to do anything.
No, that's true. That's true. He acts by not acting, and thus perpetuates the very situation. At least linking the fire gives a little bit of restoration.
It
Um,
might be wrong in the long term, right? Specifically in the world of Dark Souls, but it's an action, right?
there's a comparison to be made here as well, because you've mentioned the Norse kind of connections here, the Norse worldview, and I think and Tolkien talks about this idea of um, you've got the gods led by Odin, and they are in perpetual conflict with the giants
Yep.
and the monsters. And an interesting Dark Souls 2 kind of takes that up more very explicitly with Vendrick's fighting the giants.
Yes.
But eventually, there's going to be a final battle, and it's fated at this final battle, Ragnarok, that Odin and the gods are going to be destroyed, and that a new age will begin where they are no longer
Yeah.
there. And nonetheless, Odin, with the aid of the heroes of men, fights tooth and nail against the monsters, even though he knows he's going to die, and he does
Mm,
die. Spoilers for Norse
right.
mythology. But the the thing is, with that kind of worldview, is that you could say then, well, Gwyn, and let's not forget, Gwyn is identified with the race of gods, or self-proclaimed as the gods.
Mhm.
So that there is that connection again. Gwyn is taking on that role. He foresees the age of dark is coming, the flame is fading, and you could interpret it, although I know you've got a bit of a different interpretation, that he's resisting this age of dark as long as he possibly can by linking the
Right.
fire. So that's also being brought into this as well. That this is a
Well,
resistance against the encroaching and inevitable for as long as possible.
That's true, but even then, there's a tipping point there at some point, because when you meet Gwyn at the end of Dark Souls, he's already hollowed, more or less. I mean, it's basically a husk. At that point, Gwyn is probably one of the easier bosses in the game, considering your own skill and your own power as a player. And I think that's obviously intentional from the developers. You know, it's this sad husk of what once was, sitting alone at this bonfire, right? Um, and uh, he's basically dragging the whole world down with him. Um, but at the same time, I can't help but think, going back to Tolkien, um, when he presents sort of the same conundrum, he does it, and you talked a bit about this in your essay, and I've spoken a bit about it. I believe he does that through Theoden and Rohan, because Rohan is obviously, when we encounter Rohan in the books and in the movies, a civilization very much in the deepest of winters, right? But through deciding to fight a doomed battle, more or less, in the mind of Theoden, I think, let's say the Pelennor Fields, for example, uh, I think in his mind, as far as I understand the writings, there's no question that he thinks he's going to die. But you know, he has his now for wrath, now for ruin speech and charges anyway, and in a certain way, in the way that only Tolkien can, through his sort of merging of these different cultures and religions, uh, the metaphorical hand of God comes down and saves Rohan from certain doom, right? Through this refusal of defeat. And I can't help but be excited at the thought of that there is a path forward. And it's much more fun to go down fighting than just giving up. So maybe I'm a Gwyn stan after all.
You're a true Gwyn stan. It's revealed. I guess though. So I was actually talking about this kind of topic last night on a stream I was doing on. Well, I was calling for a new heroic archetype beyond Tolkien, which might be surprising given I love Tolkien and have been promoting him vehemently within the sphere. But it struck me that what you've just described there with Theoden, he is fighting a hopeless battle, but nonetheless it's still in defense of something that he has, which is his
Hmm.
kingdom, his family, his traditions and culture, and so on. And that kind of defensive character is also true of Odin at Ragnarok. It's true of many of your Anglo-Saxon heroes. It's this rear guard, last stand. Okay, we're all going to die, but we're going to defend the warmth of the hearth all the while stronger. But
Right.
what if you're a people who don't have any of those things anymore? What
Yeah,
if
I
there's
mean,
very
Gwyn
little to
doesn't
hang
really
on
have
to?
anything left, right?
Right, or if you're a hollow who's cursed, who's become a cursed undead because of Gwyn's linking the fire, you have no share in the illusory greatness of Gwyn's kingdom of Anor Londo. You have no
To the
kind of
point where
status in the world.
you're feeding Anor Londo, right? Your very
Yes.
cursed existence is because of Anor Londo existing, right?
Right. Why would what's in it for you linking the fire? What's in it for you for being this defensive hero? In a way, you could be the thing which ushers in like a whirlwind, a new order, or seeks a new spark for a new civilization. A kind of Promethean hero, perhaps,
Right.
of some kind. But that's going off beyond Dark Souls, I guess. But I
Well,
think,
yes and no. What's
yeah,
difficult here is that, some things in Dark Souls exist only in Dark Souls, and something in real life exists only in real life. And some
mm.
things would work in Dark Souls that wouldn't work in real life, and vice versa, of course.
But I guess if you so part of the Age of Dark prophecy that Gwyn fears. So Gwyn fears the dark, the coming dark, and there's this idea that there will be a dark lord who rises up and overthrows the gods and oversees this Age of Dark. And
Right.
it's suggested, is it Kath, uh, the serpent, the primordial serpent, he says to you, you can be that Dark Lord if you overcome Gwyn
It
and
is
refuse to
suggested,
link the fire.
yes.
Yes. So
I'm not
there
sure
is
what is canon, but yeah.
so there is this idea that, okay, you can bring in a new age by overturning Gwyn. So perhaps that's the kind of hero that's needed for winter. I almost feel like
Right.
Tolkien's heroes are heroes of autumn. They live in the
Mm,
decay. They're holding on to something, but it's
right.
still possible to keep it going for a bit longer. And
I
Gwyn
think in
belongs
Dark
to that.
Souls 2, if you choose the Age of Dark ending, you'll get like a quote in the new version of Dark Souls 2, the Scholar of the First Sin, you'll get a quote from Aldia where it says something about, the Age of Dark is feared, but I'm paraphrasing here, but it's got the limitless possibility, right?
Mm.
It's he's basically saying this is going to be rough, but it's going to be worth it. That's your choice, right? That's what he's telling you. That's the choice you made when you choose the Age of Dark. Um, and I certainly do agree. The hard choices or the best choices are very often the hardest ones, right?
Very much so. And you mentioned Spengler there, and it's the age of winter, which then precedes the age of spring, the coming of a new civilization. And something you mentioned in our discussions beforehand was that by prolonging the fire, so it keeps fading. In Dark Souls 3, it's like a tiny little fire, just a spark almost that's remaining, even
Mm.
when you restore it. By doing that, you're preventing the space for a new flame to come. And part of the kind of cyclical nature of the Dark Souls universe is that it's certainly hinted at the end of Dark Souls 3 that there will be another flame if there is an Age of Dark. Like it will
Right,
come
and,
again.
and and that's interesting because that's not a question really that Dark Souls 1 allows. It sort of
Mm,
locks you in the two-party system of there's either no flame or a flame. It says nothing about, all right, but what if the cycle is actually flame and then a whole cycle over a new flame? And some may interpret Dark Souls 2 as being that sort of a world in which we're one cycle over, uh, and you have some echoes of the previous age, but I'm not really sure about that. Uh, um, my point is that there's no reason why there couldn't be another flame, I think, in Dark Souls. But someone like Gwyn is definitely locked within his worldview in that sense. He's unable to see the darkness as anything more than not flame, right?
most definitely. And you can understand it. His power rests upon that flame.
Oh
And
yes.
he doesn't want to lose that, of course.
Oh.
Uh, um, it might also be worth mentioning how perverse it is how his family try to keep linking the fire, like what's happened, like the perversity of his family. And I think that you've already mentioned it with Gwendolyn, um, but
I
there is
didn't
this like
mention the specifics.
well, maybe we'll come to Gwendolyn, but certainly
Yeah.
let's start with Guinevere because she's a more obvious candidate. So well actually there's somebody else, the name the his eldest son, who was a mighty warrior who ought to be the one who takes over from Gwyn. He rejects Gwyn's path, right? He does something we're never told explicitly what he did in Dark Souls, but he's been banished from the kingdom.
Mm.
And this already should ring alarm bells to anybody who kind of has that knowledge of um, mythology and the need for the eldest son to take over from the father and so on. It is suggested in some people have suggested in Dark Souls 3 the character, the nameless king, is this eldest
I
son.
think it's pretty explicit if you look at sort of the items that he can drop and things like that.
Right.
It's certainly intentional to be at least hinting that he is the firstborn son of Gwyn. Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting about that then is when you fight the nameless king, he's riding a dragon, and he's kind of presiding over a world filled with these serpents and dragons and so on.
Yeah.
Well, of course, Gwyn's enemies were the dragons, so it seems like he's betrayed Gwyn. He's
For the
made
dragons. Yeah.
he's followed the dragons against what Gwyn's doing, which is extending the fire. So there is you made the very good suggestion, I think, that perhaps he rejected the linking of the fire as a disastrous thing for the world.
It might be. I mean, I don't think that's explored anywhere. Maybe if someone in the chat can let us know, but I don't remember ever hearing that that's explicitly being sort of the reason why he left or why he got exiled or why he sided with the dragons. But I could certainly see that being the case. And if I were to like if I were to write the story of the lore of Dark Souls, I mean that would be the moment that the big dramatic moment that made him leave, right? Or made him exile or made him turn to the dragons. I think thematically it makes very much sense because the dragons and nature is sort of, that's another one of these like layers that Dark Souls have. It's this, you have the civilizational cycles, but then you also have the man versus nature sort of aspect of it, where I see, the dragons and of course the perennial old world with the trees and all this representing the timelessness of nature, but also, beasts and, well, I guess unconsciousness, right? Which is then also reflected in the Hollow. I think someone in chat said that in Dark Souls 3 you meet Hollow who are literally turning into trees. They're turning back into nature. So I was more on point with that than I realized. And I need to remember. Yes, I was talking about the Nameless King. That's where I was going with this. And as sort of like a vessel for usurping his father, I mean, turning back to nature seems, the correct choice there.
I think that's right. That it is nature versus the unnatural, and that's something with the linking of the fire. It's an unnatural thing. It seems like the cycle was meant to be that it would fade and go into an age of dark, and Gwyn has gone against the cycle. He's holding everything in stasis, and that's why it's decaying. That's why there's the unnatural coming forth. But somebody else who also tried to avoid the age of dark was the Witch of Izalith.
Some are saying that he was exiled because he lost the annals. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So he was like the keeper of histories. This is apparently translated from Japanese. So, sorry, you were saying.
No, that's really interesting. The Witch of Izalith, who was one of the 4 who found the first flame with Gwyn, she tried to avoid the Age of Dark coming into being by creating a new flame. But this flame it didn't work. Instead, it created the Abyss, the place of chaos, of demons.
It didn't work is a bit of an understatement, yes. It went horribly wrong, yes.
Yes.
And now there's demons in the world, essentially.
Yeah, so this is an example of it causes trying to stop the Age of Dark brings about the unnatural, that which doesn't fit with reality. And you can see that with the demonic, because even just in their forms, they are just so grotesque and unfitting with the world. I think the best example I could think of was when you fight Eudex Gundyr at the beginning, and in his first phase, he's just a normal warrior. Then suddenly this kind of great black worm bursts out of him, and you're fighting this huge monster, this demon, and it's absolutely horrific. And that is what the Abyss caused. That's what trying to create your own flame causes. It sets everything wrong. So you can see, in a way, that's instructing us about what Gwyn's doing just as much as what the witch tried to do.
And I also think this is one of the things where you can draw more or less direct parallels to our own situation in the real world. I mean, even in just sort of the quote unquote microcycles of civilization that we find ourselves in. I mean, a lot of the issues we are facing in the world today as a society are because of people sort of refusing to give up on ways of doing things or ways of seeing things that obviously aren't working anymore. They're clinging desperately to a way of, let's say, government or a way of or a mandate that doesn't really exist anymore, right? And trying to resurrect that and trying to keep that sort of that weekend at Bernie's thing where everything is fine, guys, right?
While it's on fire. Yeah. I guess. Yeah, I think that's right, and you can see this perhaps with the issue which is very prevalent at the moment, where there's this constant refrain of, oh, if we don't have massive migration, for example, then our population is going to decline. We're not going to have enough people to sustain the current order as it is.
We literally, need to throw bodies on the fire, right? Into the furnaces to keep the economy going, to keep the GDP going up, to keep the fire linked. Essentially,
Keep the fire linked, right?
we
Yeah.
literally need to throw bodies on the pyre.
and there's no sense of, oh, we could retract, we could become a smaller people like we once were, and maybe do away with some of these things. No, we just have to keep on growing and growing and growing. So there is that sense of committed to something which clearly isn't necessarily it's not in the best interests of the body, but we'll do it anyway because we can't think of anything else to do. We can't even imagine what it would be like doing
In
it
the Age
another
of
way.
Dark.
In the
Right.
Age of Dark, yes.
Which is very much true. I mean, none of us here, except, maybe a few of us who are lucky to be born with, some seem to be born with the gift of prophecy, are able to imagine what the future holds for our civilization. In terms of, how hard is it going to be? What skills are going to be needed? What challenges are we going to have to face? It's baffling to think about, and especially when you're sitting inside the fishbowl, right?
No, that's very true, and it's one of the problems. I guess many people were talking about at the conference and so on. Is we are also children of the ashes, we might say.
Exactly.
So it's we think in that world, and perhaps also that's why it's quite good, a good conclusion to the games that it ends when it ends, because who could actually design the Age of Dark when we were all children
Right.
of the ashes?
What would that look like? Yeah. Better they went on to something different.
Yes, yes. We don't want that sequel, I guess. But is it worth saying something about Guinevere as well?
Yes, sorry, we only did one of his his
One
children.
of his
Let's keep
broods.
going. Yes.
So Guinevere, as far as I understand, she's Gwyn's daughter, and at various points she has various marriages and various relationships and various children. But the thing that I wanted to draw attention to was in Dark Souls 3. I think it's I'm not sure if it's explicitly said, but it's heavily implied at the very least that Guinevere has been the queen of Lothric, and she has been, which is where the game is largely set, and she has been married to the king of Lothric, Osiris, I think his name is, and they have been trying to produce a son or an heir who will be able to link the fire. And the children that they had, Lorien and Prince Lothric. Well, Prince Lothric was meant to be the one to link the fire. He had been chosen for that path, and the whole game kind of is instigated because he refuses that task. He abandons it and doesn't want to move forward with it. And one can understand why. I mean, he's it's supposed to be the mighty who link the fire. They have it brought in the souls of their conquered victims into their own. And as we were alluding to earlier, it's only when you have that power that you have the right to direct the world. Lothric is this decrepit, kind of half a man almost. He's almost a
Yeah.
skeleton. He's pathetic. He can't walk. He has to climb on his brother's back when you fight him. There's no sense in which he is truly mighty, and this is where the House of Gwyn has ended, with Lothric. So the couple, Guinevere and Osiris, try to have another son who will take the place of Lothric initially, and Osiris is kind of driven towards becoming a dragon, or embracing the power of the dragons within himself for this end. So he becomes this kind of horrible half dragon, half man creature, who then mates with his wife Guinevere, and they have a son, Ocelot, who we never see in the game, but he is meant to be the solution to this problem. And well, what kind of situation have we arrived at, that where the only way to save the civilization is to have this weird half-breed dragon human who's the son of this mutant? It's all become very twisted and
Right.
dark. Yeah.
Like cradling, half-dead fetuses at the bottom of a, catacomb or something. I don't
Right,
remember
yeah.
quite where you encounter him, but something like that, right?
Mhm. Yes, that's right. That's right. It's at the bottom of some gardens, hidden away, that you may not even see if you're the player. You don't have to go that way. But he's down there, and you don't see the child, but you just hear it wailing in the background. So it's unclear whether it's actually there, or if it's just a memory, or if it's died, or whatever. Yeah.
And then there's Gwendolyn as well, which
Yes,
we mentioned.
you can take Gwendolyn.
All right, let me just double check. That is the correct name, right?
Yeah.
So Gwendolyn is the youngest son of Gwyn, meaning the last born child. And at the time of Dark Souls 1, he is essentially the custodian of Anor Londo, because most of Anor Londo is an illusion of Gwendolyn's making. And he was born... There's something in the Dark Souls, which we've totally skipped this, but this also happens in Elden Ring as well. And it happens, many places, to many scholars' chagrin, that, the women, the female forms are usually associated with the moon, and the male is usually associated with the sun. And so it is in Dark Souls as well, where the types of magic you can do is usually it's moon magic for women and sun magic for men. But Gwendolyn was, I think, strong in moon magic, which already sort of put him off in the eyes of his father, Gwyn. He was also, fragile, and wasn't as beautiful as his eldest son. And I think eventually, I don't remember like the order of things, but he has like tentacles, like half of his body is like snakes and stuff like that. So what happened? And here is where I get into like a weird... This is why I feel this is like a weird Japanese thing, right? But maybe you can correct me, because you know more about Western sort of lore than I do. But Gwendolyn was raised as a female by his father. Gwyn made him wear women's clothing, made him like move and behave like a girl, sort of as a punishment for not being the son he wanted. And I'm not sure if that happens anywhere in Western lore.
I can't think of anywhere off the top of my head. No.
So I have to think that this is coming from some, Japanese stuff, where this is like an ultimate punishment in a way. So this, understandably, uh, kind of fucks up Gwendolyn in all the ways, really, where in this elaborate illusion of Anor Londo, he conjures a fake Guinevere. He keeps the sun, he keeps like the lights on, basically, like the sun in Anor Londo is fake. And I don't think you even have to kill him. I think you can only kill him in Dark Souls 1 if you actually realize that the illusion of Guinevere is fake. If you attack Guinevere in the at the top of the cathedral, that's when you'll sort of unlock Gwendolyn as a boss. And he is, a weird, spiteful little creature at that point, who's basically just clinging to this like fake version of his childhood. That's what I think is going on, honestly. I think he shows up in Dark Souls 3, but he's sort of just being puppeteered, like his corpse is just kind of like shaking him around, like some other entity is basically shaking his corpse around to produce
Yeah, that's right.
magic. Yeah,
That's right. Because
like
so
some
in that
sort of like baby rattle, right?
yeah, he's just become an absolute puppet by that point. Because well, when you see the sad fate of it, it's in Dark Souls 3, Anor Londo has been totally conquered by well, first by Pontiff Sullivan and his knights, but then Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, who is one of the Lords of Cinder who decided not to relink the fire. He is a man-eater and also a devourer of gods. And after kind of being reawoken, he heads to Anor Londo to devour what's left of Gwyn's race. And so he finds Gwendolyn locked in Anor Londo and starts devouring his body.
Oh,
So
that's what's happening. Yeah.
so when you fight Aldrich, he uses the current corpse of Gwendolyn that he's currently devouring as the means for fighting you. So it's this very bizarre situation where you're kind of fighting Gwendolyn, but it's not Gwendolyn; it's Aldrich working
In
through
that
him.
sense, it's a bit of an interesting boss the first time you fight him, because you're
Mm.
used, like, your mind obviously looks at the human form of Gwendolyn,
Yes.
but if you're trying to fight that boss, I mean, you're not going to be able to predict its movements. If you look at Gwendolyn, you have to look at sort of the monster beneath, which is a lot more undefined. So it's a bit interesting sort of take on just the mechanics of it.
Oh, very much so. And where you get the most damage is on Aldrich. If you're aiming for the body, it's very little,
Right,
very
right.
little damage. Yeah. So, but just think about how sad that the situation of here's was once the mighty kingdom of Gwyn that came from conquering the dragons and striding across the world, and it ends in a whimper with Gwendolyn being devoured by a giant slug. Like that is the end of Anor Londo.
Jesus. Yeah.
And yet we're supposed to try and restore this or maintain it if we link the fire. Like it doesn't seem like this should be carried on.
Yeah. No, I mean, if you're playing Dark Souls 3, at least for the first time without any other sort of explanation or having played any of the other games, there has to be a moment where you're thinking, the classic, like, are we the baddies, right? Is this really the way to go, right?
Indeed, definitely. And it's I guess the one hope you might have is, oh well, this will be that if I link the fire, this will overturn all of this darkness. And I think in Dark Souls 1, you might still have that hope.
Yes,
That
that's fair. Yeah.
so Anor Londo, okay, it's an illusion, but it will be restored to what it once was if I link the fire.
Yeah, by Dark Souls 3, I mean it's a point of the plot that didn't really work, right? Because otherwise the kings that you're hunting down wouldn't, or the heroes you're hunting down wouldn't have refused, right?
No, exactly. exactly. But you might say as well, so this is Gwyn's biological line, and it's utterly failed both in terms of his initial descendants and then later with Prince Lothric and so on. They are totally unworthy to link the fire, even if they could. Perhaps only the Nameless King is worthy, but the rest
Yeah, but
are
I think he would
not.
refuse, right?
Right, so none of them are worthy to carry on Gwyn's legacy. And this, I think, again, returns to the Japanese idea in part of the family where, okay, if you do not have a son who's able to carry on the business, you go and adopt a man who's worthy to do that. And you could
Mm.
relate this to Carlyle and the great man or the hero. For Carlyle, it's not a matter of being descended from the right man who's already in power. It's whether you have the character, the force of will, the desire and strength to impose yourself upon the world, which defines you as that which you know, is a great man who ought to rule. And so there might be a
And again,
criticism.
in Dark
Sorry, go ahead.
Souls, the video game, but also in the world as a function of being in a video game, that's quite literal, right? That
Right, yeah.
power is, there's a number down in the bottom right of your screen of how powerful you are, right?
Hmm. Definitely. And as we were mentioning, by the time of the end of the game, you have become worthy to take on the mantle of the king, essentially, to sit on the throne and decide the fate of the world. And perhaps part of the problem that the game's exploring is, well, if we just stick with this, Gwyn was a great man. He's no longer, but he was a great man. But if we just live in his legacy, well, that tradition becomes hollow, quite literally.
Quite
and
literally, yeah.
and it requires what maintains civilizations is other great men, but they
Mm.
may not come from that tradition. They may have to overturn it.
Right, and they may only emerge in an age of dark, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I think there's an interesting kind of maybe criticism of royalty or assuming that descendant from a monarch equals right to rule. And perhaps you could extend that to other forms of
Perhaps,
government
yeah.
as well.
Interesting. There's so many threads to this. We talked about doing like a two-parter, um, but we're coming up on almost 1.5 hours now. So I'm thinking we should try to end it soon. If anyone has any sort of questions they want to get in here before we leave. At this point, I feel there's so much more we could talk about that we might have to do another episode at some point.
That might be a good idea.
We
Yeah.
barely touched well, I did talk a bit about dragons and nature and stuff, but we didn't get to link that to Nordic culture or I mean tradition.
Mm.
We didn't talk about Berserk and that imagery. Now, to be honest, I haven't interacted with Berserk in any way. There's something about Elric as well that feeds into this, I think.
Hmm. Yes.
Which is,
Well,
of course, a bit more modern fantasy than a lot of the others. Sorry,
well, and
yes.
there was also the stuff you were talking about, hollowing as a
Oh,
curse
yes,
caused
we
by
skipped
linking the
all of
fire.
that. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hollowing interpreted as the loss of purpose. Yeah.
yeah. So
We
there's a whole lot of things that we could talk about in
yes.
another stream.
Let's see
um,
here.
hmm.
Voltaire, then Tutalin Krieg says, Walrus, is there some Heideggerian existentialist commentary in Dark Souls, the concept of throneness? I'll be honest and say that Heidegger is not something I've gotten to yet. I am still deep in other philosophers. Do you have any knowledge of Heidegger?
I'm afraid I don't. Um, I'm
I
sorry,
know
I
Ludwig
really can't
Path
speak to
probably
it.
does. So I
Yes.
have the philosophy 101 introduction to Heidegger, which I did in university. But that's it, which is basically, oh, he did something and he was also a Nazi. I think that's what they teach in school these days.
That's about it.
uh, yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a lot of catching up to do on Heidegger. I'm sorry. Let's see here. Leo Borealis says more. You didn't really talk about Dark Souls 2 at all. That's fair. We could talk about Dark Souls 2 a lot as well. I did mention Vendrick. Uh, Dark Souls 2 is interesting because it interacts with a lot of the imagery of Dark Souls 1 and 3, but it also sort of built its own commentary on top of it. And there's probably some reasons for that, sort of real life reasons, considering that the game director is not the same as for 1 and 3. It's not, the auteur figure isn't as strong in Dark Souls 2, it seems. But I think in the new version, I say the new version, it's basically the one that's been, it's the Scholar of the First Sin edition, which has been like current
Mhm.
since, yeah, for as long as I can remember. It really has its own commentary on the idea of like a monarch, and this, it really goes deep into what we talked about, this whole idea that you have to earn the right to decide the fate of the world, sort of, and what that really entails.
I think that's right. It sharpens that more than Dark Souls 1 and 3. Um, the language of the throne. You literally sit on a throne at the end of the game. It really highlights that.
Voltaire says the games feels like a false reality, like purgatory, which parallels with reality of playing video games in general. Well, that's very interesting because Dark Souls is a game that a lot of people, and we talked about this as well, Nathan, as sort of like a millennial man, or let's say a young Gen Xer. If you're sort of like picking 10 men of similar age out of, society, what you probably have in common is that you've gone to school and that you've played Dark Souls, and that's something you can bond over, right? It's those two things. And the Dark Souls games, despite being video games, are designed in a way that taps into this very visceral, deep, sort of almost bestial feeling, or I guess sort of primal feeling, that I think a lot of men have when they sort of face challenges that they overcome. Um, I remember when I last played some of the Dark Souls games. I think I was playing Dark Souls 3, which I hadn't played. I think that was my first time playing Dark Souls 3 many years ago. And my girlfriend was sitting at the couch next to me. And I decided that I wanted to play Dark Souls 3. I'd been going through like Dark Souls 1, 2, and 3. And every time I did a different sort of character build, right? And when I got to Dark Souls 3, I was like, okay, this one is the hard one, quote unquote. I'm gonna play this one without any shield or anything like that. I'm gonna, dual wield, be a Giga Chad, and try that. And of course, I got my ass beat, right? But I'm playing against a boss, right? I'm getting frustrated because it's difficult. I'm shouting at the screen a bit, right? Um, and my girlfriend, my girlfriend at the time, is like, you're getting mad at the video game. I'm like, I'm not mad, I'm just frustrated at the experience. I'm having fun. Right? She's like getting upset with me because I'm getting mad at the game, right? You don't have to be mad, it's only a game. And I'm thinking, no, this is part of the experience. Let me shout at the screen, because then the victory I get when I finally beat it is going to be so much greater, because I have sort of fake wallowed in this frustration, right? And my fake reward when I beat it is going to be this much greater. And it's not that I'm angry, I'm just sort of, I'm deep in the emotions. And it's so strange that um a video game can really make you feel that. It's almost kind of scary, because no game has made me feel like that since and before.
Mhm.
Like, games can be fun and interesting and deep and engaging, but never as sort of visceral.
That's beautifully put. It's that, and that's, I guess, what part of what Voltaire may be saying here is that the modern world, we don't get to have that experience very often. Certainly not in
Exactly. Yeah.
working life. Whereas, perhaps if you go back to your primal hunter and so on, when you're facing the woolly mammoth in battle, you know, for food and so on. That probably is similar to
I
that kind
think
of
that's what's
experience.
happening. Like, if you want to be
Yeah.
like Reddit about it, like it's firing the same sort of neurons in my brain, right? Somehow.
Mhm. It's like going back to it, but in a fake way.
Yeah. In a
It's
fake
through
way,
a
obviously.
yeah,
Which
through a
is
video
kind
game.
of sad, right? Because you as I said, you can talk to another man who's played the game and you
Mm,
both understand this, right? That's the bonding experience of this. But it's not like you've served in the army together, right?
right.
It's not
Yeah.
like you have had an actual bonding experience. It's not like you have had something real. No, you just spent like 100 hours playing a video game, right? And it was enjoyable, don't get me wrong, but I mean, yeah. At the end of the day, what have I got to show for it, right?
I guess if you wanted to move it beyond just the primal hunter, if you look at somebody like Nietzsche, who sees life as perpetual struggle, and you know that does connect with Buddhism. Life is suffering. Life is taking on the challenge, and it is in the overcoming. You know, you become the
Mm,
Ubermensch, you become the great
yeah,
man. But it's a constant struggle. You don't just end there. You keep on struggling. Um, and it's those moments of victory which give it its overall beauty along with the
mm,
defeat. That's what it's hitting on, that really deep thing in which is at the heart of reality. And our lives are so covered by comfort and therapeutic thinking, escaping from
exactly.
that,
Yeah,
that we're suddenly
S-
exposed to it in a very
having
visceral way.
something sit you down and be like, "This is the bar to meet," right? And
Right.
it's gonna hurt like hell, but when you're on top, it's gonna be great. And it's the first time in 20 years you've ever felt something like that, right?
Wow. This is putting me into existential angst now. but
I'm sorry.
But just just connected to that though, because you're talking about the bonding experience, something we need to talk about next time, and I really hope we do it next time because I think it's been really good. Is the interaction with other players within the game, that they can
Oh
both
yeah,
be
right.
come and help you, and they can also come and kill you. So you know that bonding experience is also in a strange way in the game itself. Um, you know, genuinely engaging with other
Yes,
people.
yes. And
So
I think that's
we should talk about that at some point.
yeah, no, let's save it for that. Let's save it for that time. But yeah, I almost went off on an entirely different thing. All right. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you for coming here and hanging out with us. Uh, looking at my notes, talking to you now, I think we're gonna have to do this again sometime. I don't know
Yes.
when, but it should probably be on your channel at some point, Nathan. Um, but we'll just have to talk and see when that should be. Um, so for those of you who might not know who you are, why don't you plug all of your socials and where they can find your stuff? You write some really good articles.
Oh, thank you. Well, I have a YouTube channel, Nathan CJ Hood. I talk a lot about mythology and fantasy, Tolkien, and so on. And you can find a lot of my stuff there. I also have a Twitter account under the same name. And I've written a few essays as well for Praxarchy. I think you were alluding to one earlier, Walrus, looking at some of these kind of issues, I guess, in fantasy and how they relate to current culture, politics, and so on as well. So please do join us over there, and there will be a Dark Souls stream there in the future, I'm sure.
You also did a hit stream. Like, a lot of the stuff you do is great, but I think it got a lot of attention. You did a stream with Apostolic Majesty
Oh
about
yes.
fixing the prequel trilogy. So if anyone is unfamiliar with Nathan Hood and sort of want a kickstart, go watch that one. That was great.
That was
All
good
right.
fun. That was good fun. And I
And
believe you did another Star Wars stream very soon after as well. It was
yes,
very enjoyable.
that wasn't really, it wasn't intentional. I was just we were talking about things to talk about on the Longhouse, and it was one of those weeks where not much is happening, and what did happen was kind of boring to talk about. And I was like, you know what? I'm just gonna talk about like old Republic Star Wars lore for an hour, and bring some
Hmm.
other people along to be subjected to it. So
It was
I'd
wonderful.
also opened up my copy of Hero with a Thousand Faces because
Mm.
of it. So I went deep in some comparisons there with Star Wars because, well, I'm not going to redo the stream, but a lot of Star Wars is obviously based heavily on the work of Joseph Campbell.
Yes.
All
Mhm.
right. As for me, I have a Twitter called a walrus or at walrus in a suit. You can follow me there as well. If you're not subscribed to this channel, please do. Every Thursday, we have a show called The Longhouse where we talk about, well, a variety of topics, but mostly with what we call the true right Nordic perspective. So please check that out every Thursday night. And as for this stream, I hope I'll see you guys sometime on Nathan's channel, hopefully soon. All right. Bye bye.